Russian President Vladimir Putin proclaiming the annexation of 4 partially occupied Ukrainian regions at a signing ceremony in the Kremlin. The 4 regions to be incorporated into Russia include Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine and Kherson and Zaporizhzhia in southern Ukraine. The signing of these treaties came just 3 days after the completion of referendums organized by Moscow on joining Russia, which Putin described as the will of millions of people. Delivering one of his toughest anti-West speeches in more than 20 years in power, Putin signaled he was ready to continue what he called a battle for a greater historical Russia.
Будет определять будущую геополитическую реальность. Уважаемые друзья, сегодня мы боремся за справедливый и свободный путь. Прежде всего, убежден, страны и народы понимают, что политика, построенная на исключительности кого бы то ни было, на подавлении других культур и народов, по сути своей преступна. Что мы должны перевернуть эту позорную страницу.
Ukraine, the European Union, the United States and the United Nations have denounced Russia's move, calling the annexation illegal and in violation of international law. Accusing Russia of redrawing borders using murder, blackmail and lies, Ukraine applied for fast-track membership of NATO, something Moscow fiercely opposes.
Ми де-факто союзники. Це вже досягнуто. Де-факто ми вже пройшли свій шлях в НАТО. Де-факто ми вже довели взаємосумісність зі стандартами Альянсу. Вони реальні для України, реальні на полі бою і в усіх аспектах нашої взаємодії. Ми довіряємо один одному, ми допомагаємо один одному, і ми захищаємо один одного. Це і є Альянс. Де-факто.
UN Chief Antonio Guterres described Russia's annexation plan as a dangerous escalation. He said the move was against international law and deserves to be condemned. With the annexation of the 4 regions, along with Crimea that was annexed in 2014, Russia now occupies 20% of Ukrainian territory. So what will be the implications of Russia's annexation move? Will it further escalate the 7-month-long Russia-Ukraine war? Will it deepen the global divide? That and much more on this edition of the Global Debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teena. Pleased to welcome an illustrious panel for the various perspectives on what's happening on the Russia-Ukraine war front. Mr. Fred Weir, he's political analyst and expert on Russian affairs. He's been covering Russia and the former Soviet Union since 1998. Mr. Weir, thank you for your time. Welcome to Sansad TV. Also delighted to have Ms. Teena Shevchuk. She's political expert of NGO International Center of Ukrainian Victory. And Ms. Anne Peters, director at Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, Germany. She's also a professor of international law. Thank you and pleased to have both of you as well on this edition of the Global Debate. Ms. Teena Shevchuk, let me in fact begin the program today with you. So we've seen how Russia has announced the annexation plan of 4 more regions, this in addition to Crimea, and together with Crimea, 20% of Ukrainian territory is now belongs to Russia. How is the annexation announcement by Russia being seen in Ukraine? Was it something that was expected since the war began in February?
First of all, I should say that those territories do not belong to Russia. They are occupied by Russia. And none of their pronouncements of Putin or their boots on the ground will make ever this territory belong to Russia under international law and under any moral law. As for their signing papers or proclamation of annexation, we've been expecting this for months already. But it's very funny because Russia proclaims annexation of territories which it doesn't control. So it doesn't control the Donetsk region in full. It doesn't control Zaporizhzhia region in full, Kherson region in full. There are heavy fightings happening now in Luhansk region, and Russian forces are actually retreating. So this is like the theater for their own citizens to showcase that the war is really having some results. But in fact, it's a useless war which kills thousands of Ukrainians, but also kills thousands of Russian soldiers. And thousands of Russian soldiers are dying for nothing. They are collapsing on the battleground, and all they have is the TV shows that Putin makes or on the main square. This goes nowhere but to Russian defeat.
You're right. War has been devastating for both sides. So not just Ukraine, also Russian soldiers have died. There has been loss of property, loss of lives for both sides. It's not been good for either side and has had global implications as well. Mr. Weir, as someone who's been covering Russia for several decades now, what, according to you, are the objectives behind Russia's annexation plan? How do you decode this annexation plan of Vladimir Putin?
It is unusual that this is happening right now when most of these territories are still being contested on the battlefield. That's something I can't explain. But I think that we've seen rather clearly in the past year or so that Vladimir Putin has moved beyond the previous framework. He did think that his Ukraine problem, as he sees it, could have been solved with a declaration of neutrality and implementation of the Minsk Accords. I know from I also cover Ukraine, that whereas Russia has been investing heavily in Crimea for the last 8 years, it hasn't invested much of anything in Donetsk and Luhansk, because they thought it would be going back to Ukraine until quite recently. So this departure, it started in February. The idea, I think, now is to solve the problem by war, and the plan has been gone through different permutations. And now I think the plan is to permanently annex these territories in Russian law, and then win them on the battlefield. For that, there is a mobilization going on. It's happening in a typically Russian chaotic way, arbitrary and not well organized, but in fact it is happening, and hundreds of thousands of Russian men are being mobilized now, and will probably be ready within a few months. So I think what this signifies is, in Putin's mind, the historical restoration of these territories, which were part of Russian-led states for hundreds of years, but also the confrontation with NATO and the United States that he sees as imposing an order on Russia that is against Russia. They have a long list of grievances there. No need to rehearse it, but this is the way the Russians see it, that they will finish this in a way that restores Russia to what Putin sees as Russia's rightful place.
In fact, Mr. Weir, not just the Russians, we've been seeing visuals coming in from the international news agencies and visuals of celebrations coming in from Luhansk, one of the regions that Russia has announced it is going to annex. Does, annexation of these 4 regions, which are critical to Ukraine, does this give Russia a strategic advantage now into this 7-month-long war? Mr. Weir?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yes.
Sorry. It doesn't give them any advantage. They will still have to win it on the battlefield. But I think in the terms of, in Putin's terms, it makes it irreversible. He's drawing that line. Now the front line of the war becomes the state border of Russia in terms that are presented to the Russian people. Legally, it allows him to use the regular army because they haven't used conscripts so far. So until now, the war has been prosecuted with a mixture of volunteers, paid soldiers, kontraktniki, and the separatist militias of Lugansk and Donetsk. Now the regular army will move in, and it will be presented to them that they are defending Russian territory. That may or may not be a morale booster. I just don't know. I think there's lukewarm support for this through most of Russia, but it's too soon to say how it will play out. There's increased dissent among Russians, especially military-aged men and their mothers. But I do expect it to work in Putin's terms. I think projections of Russia's collapse or demise are greatly exaggerated. So
how this plays out and what are the kind of geopolitical implications this could have in the times to come is something that I'll come back to you in just a moment. But let me bring in Ms. Ann Peters into the discussion. First of all, Ms. Peters, your reaction to Russia's annexation move. And the second aspect that, while announcing this annexation, Vladimir Putin delivered a speech which is being described by analysts as one of the most toughest anti-West speeches in more than 20 years that he's been in power. He slammed the West as neo-colonial and as out to destroy his country. How do you interpret his remarks? Is it going to further escalate this over 7-month-long war?
Yeah, from a legal perspective, from the perspective of international law, the referendums were invalid. Such referendums cannot legalize in any way the unlawful annexation. Since the adoption of the Charter of the United Nations, the prohibition of the use of military force is a cornerstone of the international legal order, which is a universal order, and the prohibition of and the protection of territorial integrity is and non-intervention. These are leading principles of international law. They have been blatantly violated, and a referendum, even should it be the case that a majority of the population in these votes were in favor, which is impossible to assess because the referendum has been conducted under conditions of intimidation, military threat, and the context of violence. Such an operation can in no way justify any change of borders. So even if it is told to the domestic public that this will now be a defense of Russian soil from the perspective of international law, that is not true. And in fact, therefore, all other states, the entire international community, is under the obligation not to recognize any change of border. And in fact, Ukraine is entitled to the right to self-defense, also with military means. And this right to self-defense is also a collective right. And that means that, theoretically speaking, other states are entitled lawfully to support Ukraine with military means. It is not even necessary that there is a Security Council resolution that would authorize that. Such a resolution could not be adopted because Russia is a veto power and has so far vetoed such attempts to condemn the activities also from the Security Council. However, as we recall, after the starting of the war, the United Nations General Assembly had condemned with 141 votes, an overwhelming majority of states, the aggression. And I think that today, either there is already a new Security Council resolution planned or even adopted or planned. When Russia vetoes this, then it will have to explain its veto before the General Assembly. That is a new procedural rule which has been adopted in response to the unlawful aggression.
But Ms. Peters, the question here is that, a similar annexation happened back in 2014. There were sanctions that followed, but none of the countries could actually stop Russia from doing what it is doing now. So 4 of the, Ukrainian territories that it now plans to annex, treaties have been signed accordingly, and the move, it could happen anytime. Can the world community do anything about it? We couldn't do it in 2014, but can anything be done to prevent such illegal expansion of territory, as you mentioned?
I think that the annexation of Crimea has also been condemned in the General Assembly and being followed by sanctions, but to a much weaker extent than now. Also, the majority in the General Assembly in 2014 had not been so overwhelming as it is now. There is, I think, a quite prevailing view in the international community that this case is now worse. And on top, now Putin has threatened already twice, again implicitly yesterday, the use of nuclear weapons in order to prevent a stronger military response to his unlawful activities. And the problem here, the issue, there is no obstacle from the side of international law here. A military response would be lawful. It is, however, not reasonable to respond in order to prevent escalation into a nuclear war. So the problem is a problem of the possession of nuclear power of Russia. That's the main problem.
Mr. Weir, the fact that veto holding powers, it's not just Russia. There are several countries, part of the P5 who hold the veto authority and who do violate international law time and again. The United Nations only condemns it. Are we at a stage wherein we need a global authority that can actually have some teeth to stop such kind of violation, which respects the sovereignty and integrity of countries?
There is now a strong movement, the debate about reforming the United Nations Security Council and to give it, in a sense, stronger authority has been conducted for many decades, but it has gained a new momentum now. There are 5 powers who hold the veto power. These are the victorious powers from after the Second World War: United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. And it is now widely acknowledged that this is anachronistic and no longer corresponds to the current world order. I can imagine that the situation now will boost reform proposals in the sense of a better representation of countries from the global south and in the sense of somehow limiting the veto power. For example, France, together with Brazil, has already issued a proposal and has committed itself not to use the veto in case of atrocity crimes, which is, of course, a different situation.
That's an important point, Ms. Peters, that you mentioned. And let me get Mr. Weir's perspective on that. Mr. Weir, your thoughts on what Ms. Peters say about making the United Nations more inclusive, more participative, and which reflects the 21st century reality, which is not detrimental to global peace?
Well, yes, I have thought that for decades. I thought that the global order, such as it is ineffectual. This is not the first time that things have come up. We tend to think this is the great crisis of our time, but there have been quite a few of them, and quite a few wars of regime change have taken place. Kosovo created a situation where a sovereign state was dismembered against its will. Israel annexes territory at will. I mean, this is not a working system, and maybe this situation will focus minds and a broader political will. I rather doubt that it will, but let's hope that it does, because reform of the UN is long overdue.
Ms. Shevchuk, let me come back to you and understand what the Ukrainian leadership can do now. The fact that Russia is going to annex 4 of its regions, it gains not just in terms of territory, but 3 million people who now it could deploy in the war. So pitting Ukrainians who live in these regions of Luhansk, of Donetsk, of Zaporizhzhia. So pitting these Ukrainian residents against the Ukrainians, could that prove to be a turning point in the war? Ms. Shevchuk?
You're asking?
Ms. Shevchuk, am I audible to you?
I would say that people of Luhansk and Donetsk regions were already drafted, and they are already fighting in the war against their will. So it's a genocidal war in effect, because it's a war crime to draft the people of occupied regions. And if you look at the demography of these regions now, most of the males either left or already been killed in the war. So there is nobody to draft from that regions. Of course, for Crimea, for Zaporizhzhia, and parts of Kherson region which were annexed, that would be the issue. But Russians understand that most of those people do not want to fight, and they are either used in the battle as a cannon fodder, or they will disappear in favor of Ukraine. So I doubt that those people will be actively used as forces or will join their separate units. Either way, they will be mixed to the regular Russian units. I would like to stress on the one more other aspect of Russian drafting pattern. They do not draft ethnical Russians. They draft the indigenous people of Russia or their ethnic republics of Russia. So most of drafted personnel so far came from Dagestan, from Bashkiria, from Tuva. So this is the colonial way of composing the army, and they are destroying their indigenous people of Russian Federation in Ukraine. Unfortunately, Ukrainians have to fight those people because they wear Russian uniforms. But Ukraine calls to stop this destruction of national ethnic republic of Russia.
Okay. Ms. Peters, coming back to you, we've seen swift condemnations that have come in since Russia announced the annexation plan. There have also been sanctions that have been announced by the West. But what we've seen over the last 7 months is that the sanctions have hurt Europe more than what it has hurt Russia. Russia has found newer markets to sell its energy. Could more sanctions hurt Europe more in the times to come, especially at the advent of winter season? Can the European Union put its bloc together when it comes to meeting its huge energy demands?
I think that it's not clear that the sanctions have been hurting Western states more than Russia itself. I think that the Russian economy is already being in serious difficulties, and that the sanctions can still be stepped up, especially if more states also join. So I think that there is still a way to that. Depending on political will, the international community can react even stronger. The fact that the sanctions also harm those states which impose them shows that it is not only about strategy and hypocrisy of those states, because those states which sanction are ready to also sacrifice a little bit. I think that this underlines the commitment of those states to the international rule of law, that it is not only cheap talk. I would also like to add one point with regard to prior violations of international law by other states, for example, by the United States, which is also a veto power. For example, the unlawful war in Iraq of 2003. However, from a legal perspective, that war, it was unlawful, and that's clear. However, this aggression now of Russia has a different quality. For example, Iraq had been in violation of international law, and this had already also been found by the Security Council. Only the Security Council did not authorize military means, and it was unlawful to unilaterally invade Iraq.
You're right. That's an important point. But the larger point here, Ms. Peters, again, is the fact that some of these countries who have the authority of veto to exercise veto are themselves violating international law, and the United Nations can do nothing more than just condemning it. I'll come back to you, Mr. Weir, and I'll take one last question on the threat of, nuclear option. We also heard Vladimir Putin go on to say that it will still go on to any extent now to defend Ukraine, to defend Russian territory, and which includes the 4 regions of Ukraine that it is now going to annex. Could that mean that nuclear threat still persists in this ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine? And how detrimental could it be?
I've spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. I am assured that Russian nuclear weapons doctrine is that they are only to be used in the case of existential threat to the state, or that when nuclear weapons have been used against Russia. However, what Putin said the other day was that if Russia's territorial integrity was threatened, that he didn't say nuclear weapons, but he said all means at our disposal, which seems like a revision of Russian nuclear doctrine, a very dangerous and worrisome one. He may have misspoke. That's what experts I talked to say, that he didn't mean that. And indeed, Ukrainians have been attacking Russian territory with shelling and drone strikes and so on. Russia doesn't fire back with nukes. And I don't expect that even when they claim to have moved their borders forward, that they will bring nuclear weapons into it. Nevertheless, the threat is there. I believe, at least I want to believe, that the way they are expressing this threat is toward the West, to say, as a deterrent, do not get directly involved in Ukraine, because it leads to a nuclear war threshold.
Absolutely, you're right. So there is a threat, and perhaps that poses a risk to global security. That is something that countries worldwide should be worried about, and we hope that the cessation of hostilities ends. Perhaps both countries need to sit on the table and negotiate. Perhaps Russia has gone too far in terms of taking the war, but still negotiating options is something that is the best way to end a war. And we are hopeful that this war will soon end, because it's the kind of crisis that it has escalated worldwide in terms of food security, in terms of energy security, as well as geopolitical implications, is something that the world cannot ignore any further. So that having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of the Global Debate, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have all 3 of you on the program today. So that's it from us on this edition of the Global Debate today, viewers. Thank you for your time as well. I'll see you same time next week now with another topic. Until then, you take good care of yourselves and keep watching Sansad TV.